Tonight's speaker is David Raskin, who is the Mohn Family Professor of Contemporary Art History at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. David Raskin is particularly well known as a scholar of Judd and of what I sort of almost hesitate to call, but I will from the convenience minimalism and its legacies, and a skilled and thoughtful critic of contemporary art, with recent essays on, among other artists, Enrique Mart'nez Celaya, Ian Schneller, and Baer, as well as his subject tonight, Noriyuki Haraguchi. His publications include the monograph Donald Judd, published by Yale in 2010 and already recognised as a stellar contribution to a very crowded field. But he's also written extensively on Richard Serra and others of that generation. He's the recipient of a number of fellowships and awards, including from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Smithsonian, and the Luce Foundation, and of course, he was awarded a fellowship at the US Study Centre here, which has brought him to Australia and given him the chance to not only work with our wonderful colleagues at the US Study Centre who helped us bring about this evening, but also to travel in Australia, talk here in Melbourne and Canberra, and I hope it's been a rewarding experience for him. It certainly has for my colleagues throughout Australia. He's also known as an excellent teacher, awarded, given Excellence in Teaching Awards, and I don't believe one hears from, I have many friends at his institution. He's a much loved and respected colleague. Most of all, David cares about what art does, how it helps humans see, understand, and thrive. He's a thinker, he's contributed to the Encyclopedia of Aesthetics, and remains very interested in puzzling through what precisely the artwork is and does, something sort of absolutely necessary to, I think, grappling with minimalism and its challenges. He's committed to an art which, as he says, has an impact on human life, that makes demands of us, art that he calls credible, which, as he says recently in an interview, art that keeps the universe open, providing transitions rather than meanings, and which makes more demands on us than things like furniture or football games. It makes us change, and change is what it means to thrive. And I think it's really great to be able to present a speaker who really cares and feels that art challenges and transforms us. That's what I think was the sort of founding gambit of John Powell's gift to the university. It's what we all believe in, it's why we teach, it's why we research. It's a real delight to have David here. And he also says that his stated aim, and I think it's an ambition for us all, is to write a type of art history where my prose captures something of the complexity, excitement, conflict, and structure of the art I'm considering. This is a big challenge to all of us as art historians, and it's an admirable project, and I'm delighted to be able to present part of that project tonight. David's title tonight is Hiroshi Sugimoto's Inhuman Photographs. Please welcome David Raskin.
Thank you. Thank you all for having me. I should really just go home now because after that great introduction, I kind of can't add anything to what Mark said. But anyway, I am delighted to be here. I've been having a fabulous time in Australia. I appreciate Mark and the Power Institute for bringing me. I've been to Wellington, New Zealand, but I've also been to Hobart, Tasmania. I've been to Melbourne, and I'm going to Brisbane. So I've really had a great time talking to people about art ideas here. And tonight's talk is 3 entangled stories. So first I'm talking about Hiroshi Sugimoto, the Japanese photographer who's been living in the United States since the 1970s. And in many ways, Sugimoto is a classic American immigrant story. He moves to the United States to get a college education. So he gets his second college education from 72 to 74, a Bachelor's of Fine Arts at the Art Center in Los Angeles. And then as his career grows, he moves to New York City. He supports himself with a kind of high-end import-export business. So not exactly the classic corner store that many immigrants open. He imported Japanese antiquities and sold those while his career was growing. Then it grows and he becomes kind of an international jet setter, like many people in the art world, going from art fair to art fair to art fair. And then, more recently in his career, he's been reinvestigating his Japanese roots. It's kind of an interesting trajectory of a person's life that dovetails along with their career. And I'm then also talking about William James, the great American pragmatic philosopher from the turn of the last century. And I know American pragmatism isn't so well known anywhere, and it's really fallen out of favor in the United States. There was a revival with scholars, neo-pragmatists like Richard Rorty or Stanley Fish. But the height of pragmatic philosophy in the United States was in the 50s. And I, of course, didn't know any of this in college. Grew up on Derrida and Roland Barthes, just like everyone of my generation. But I got interested in American pragmatism with my first project on Donald Judd, because Judd was educated in that. He had a philosophy degree. So I was interested in trying to develop an intellectual history that led me into this interesting set of ideas. So William James, like all pragmatists, is interested in the consequences of ideas. Do they let us live more successful lives or less successful lives? So they're not interested in first principles. And this more successful life is what James notoriously called the cash value of an idea. And you could see how that would, in today's climate, really bother more leftist critics to think about ideas having cash value. But he was really interested in the payoff. What was this going to do for us? And James's great saying, which strikes me as kind of, odd to my ears, it'll probably strike you all as really weird, but he used to say, not by the roots, but by the fruits. So that's how you would judge an idea, by the fruits of the idea. And then I'm talking about David Mitchell, the English author of a number of novels, including Cloud Atlas. So Cloud Atlas, you all know, was turned into a big, huge Hollywood feature film by the Wachowskis. It starred Tom Hanks and Halle Berry. And the Wachowskis also did The Matrix with Keanu Reeves. So I'm weaving together these three entangled stories, and it actually turns out it's three withdrawal stories. So the first withdrawal, art from life. Second is life from conscious. And the third is conscious from the world. And in telling these withdrawal stories, I've been thinking a lot about belief and affect and objects, and also in some small and really superficial way, quantum physics. So this Gemsbach is from Sugimoto's first set of professional works of art. So he moves to New York City in '74 and starts these dioramas, where he goes to the American Natural History Museum and takes photographs of animals in the dioramas. So what you're looking at are stuffed Gemsbachs standing here on sort of a fake dirt grass field with a painted backdrop behind them. And he does this, 4 separate times, and the series stretches from '74 to 1990. And I don't know if looking at this, if you're having a kind of a bit of an odd experience, not being quite sure what you're looking at. They look, to me, both live but also not live. There's a kind of indeterminacy in that experience. And I'm sure that you all know that photography today is often talked about in terms laid down by Roland Barthes or Susan Sontag. So death, is the common metaphor for photography. And when they talk about that, they want to talk about, photographs are all about death because the flow of time that we live through has suddenly stopped and become part of the past. So it's no longer an overlapping waves of continuity where you have a present of the past, a present of the present, and the present of the future. Rather, you just have a this has been. But I think there's actually something stranger going on in the Sugimoto photographs around this question of time, and not exactly a metaphor of death as something past. And in looking at these, I think the photo critic Parveen Adams really nails something kind of interesting, really gets it right. And she's writing in 2005 from a Lacanian perspective, and this is what she says. She says, thinking on the photographs and affect, she says, with this object, there is no gap between the real and reality. This object does not stand in for something else. This object stands, and it isn't the referent of representation. And I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about, what Marx said about me in my introduction, and thinking about why would someone who's, interested in minimalism, which I am, be at all interested in photography? And in fact, I'm not. In general, I can't stand photography. It's because I can't stand images. When I look at my work of art, I don't want it to play this lying game where it pretends to be one thing but is actually another. So I'm completely uninterested in these kinds of representations. And yet here I am, standing before you talking about Sugimoto. And I think it's because what Parveen Adams gets is, when I look at this, I don't see a representation there. Somehow, the confusion built into the Gems box, what it is, collapses back for me into an object. So it's not about any kind of depiction. It's exactly that lack of gap between the real and the reality that makes me think about, what is this as an object doing to me? How is it affecting my feelings here? And with this kind of distancing from the image, with this belief that what I'm looking at isn't a representation, but is an object that's pushing against me, with not being sure about what's going on, I find that I'm unable to sort of figure out my reactions. I can intellectually analyze it, but I can't have any intuitive reaction to it. And I think that this is what Gregory Siegworth and Melissa Gregg wrote about affect in 2009, where they said, affect arises in the midst of in-betweenness, in capacities to act and be acted upon. And what I take Adams and Siegworth and Gregg to mean, and most who engage the themes of time and death in Sugimoto's photography, is that here the viewer feels no sense of his or her bodily presence, and consequently, it presents nowhere for time and space to adhere. Rather than let life's perpetual changes, there exists nothing but the object's stasis. I think this stasis, this fundamental stasis at this object, neither time nor space pressing upon us, is actually, rather than a semiotic or metaphorical definition of death, an aesthetic definition of death. In a lot of ways, Sugimoto knows exactly what he's doing. About these images and some of his others, he says, I make weird things. And as a photographer, Sugimoto's often grouped with the great art photographers of his generation. And although Thomas Demand on the left is younger, he and Jeff Wall are almost exactly same age. And so here on the left, I've got Thomas Demand's room from 1996. And I know that you all know what's going on there. But what Demand does is he builds these life-size models from cardboard and paper. And then he photographs the stage sets. So that's what accounts for the strange quality of this image. Like the Sugimoto diorama, I don't think that you actually thought you were looking at a real bedroom. There was something that told you that there was something strange going on in the depiction. So you can probably notice, even from back there, the lack of detail in the sheets, or this box in the front, or this sort of strange flatness of the wall behind. So there's something in that image that signals to you that is not representational with any kind of reality effect. It's something that you might believe. And I was just downtown Sydney yesterday, and so I wanted to share this with you. This is actually a mock-up of the bedroom that L. Ron Hubbard lived in the early 1970s. So I saw Big Church of Scientology. So that's where L. Ron Hubbard lived in New York City in the early 70s. It is kind of interesting because I was looking a bit into Scientology, and not because of Tom Cruise or because I'm talking about Tom Hanks later, because I was interested in Scientology and reincarnation, which I'll be talking about with Mitchell, the reincarnation side. But actually, Scientologists do believe in reincarnation because the whole point of many of their practices and beliefs is to correct the aberrations that you have built up in your past lives. And then, I've got the Jeff Wall here on the right, and I'm sure you all know that what Jeff Wall does is take all these digital images and then assemble them. So what he did over the course of 2 months was give one of these women a budget that they furnished the room, and then he photographed them living in it. But again, like in the demand, there's something here that signals to you you're not looking at a typical snapshot of a room, or of an apartment. And I was talking to Mark and thinking a lot about, Delacroix, of course, because certainly this looks like it's got the structure of liberty leading the people, with the central woman on top of the pyramid, or even more strongly than that. It's as if we're looking at Leonardo's Last Supper, as all the diagonals collapse right into her head. The diagonal from the chair and the laundry basket and the television set and the window sills. So the whole of the image is focused in a structural signal of traditional illusionistic painting. And, in that sense, I think it would be fair to think about how Jeff Wall, has managed to absorb painting into photography, and how Thomas Demand has managed to absorb sculpture into photography. And then there in the center, I've got, the Sugimoto. And what he's done with this colors of shadow is, this is actually a color series. He's best known for his black and white photographs. It's very technically oriented. He uses view cameras, develops his own black and whites. But here in this color series, in a penthouse apartment in Tokyo, he's had the walls plastered in a traditional Japanese plastering technique that absorbs light rather than reflects it. So you don't get glares off of this. And then he's photographed the light hitting the walls. And these walls are built with strange shadows. It's 3 angles, 35 degrees, 55 degrees, and 90 degrees. So, he gets exactly what he says. He gets the color of the shadows that hits the wall. So, given painting and sculpture, it seems reasonable to say that, at least in this series anyway, Sugimoto has figured out how to absorb photography within photography. Because what could be more fundamental to photography than light hitting an emulsion? And then, consequently, I think quite reasonably, you could agree with Diarmuid Costello and Margaret Iverson writing in 2012, where they write, "Photography now makes a credible claim to being the privileged object of art theory and criticism." And certainly what they mean by that is that all of the theoretical, abstracted debates about what art can be and should be plays out, if not simply in photography, at least in screen culture writ more largely. But of course, that kind of abstraction wasn't brand new in the 90s. We've seen this before, and of course, somebody with a focus on 60s art like me sees exactly the same kind of abstraction and removal and engagement with the theoretical concerns of the medium right here in the 60s. And I've got, and not for random reasons, but I've got Duchamp's Brillo box from '64, and of course Duchamp had his first one-person show in the United States in 1963 in Los Angeles at the Ferris Gallery, where he showed the Campbell soup cans lined up along the wall on little shelves like at the grocery store. And there you've got Yves Babbitt and Marcel Duchamp playing chess in a staged photograph at Duchamp's retrospective at the Norden Simon Museum in Pasadena, which is right next to LA, in 1963. And of course, behind Yves Babbitt and Marcel Duchamp, you see Duchamp's large glass back there. And what's so interesting about, I guess, the photograph, but the large glass in general, is that when you're looking at this, you get absorbed into the imagery of the large glass. So the narrative of the bride and her bachelor somehow also includes you as the witnesses to that drama. And of course, with the Brillo boxes, although they don't ever, if you see them in person, actually raise the question of whether they're a work of art or not, because they don't really look like Brillo boxes, because when you look at those, you can see it's actually silkscreen on plywood. Nonetheless, the best explanation of them, or at least a good and compelling one in the story I'm now telling, is what Arthur Danto writes in his Institutional Theory of Art, which is a kind of theory of explaining the works of art that doesn't place any attention on the actual object, but thinks about the four conditions that allow something to be art. Did an artist make it? Did a gallery show it? Did people come and look at it as art? And did others decide that it was art and decide to comment upon it and treat it as art? And of course, that question is not at all, what is it? It's how is it? And then, I've got the Sugimoto in the middle here. So this is Sugimoto's wooden box, the large glass from 2004. And you may notice that this photograph isn't glass. It's not transparent. We can't actually see through Duchamp's large glass. It turns out, and I did not know this until I started this project, there are actually 4 of these wooden copies of Duchamp's large glass. There are 2 in Tokyo. There's 1 in London. And there's 1 in Stockholm. So truly amazing, first, that they're copies, and second, that why would there be 2 in Tokyo? I know why there's 1 in Stockholm, and that's because Pontus Holden was the great Swedish curator at the Modern Museum who bought all of this fabulous American art from this period. But 2 in Tokyo, really interesting. So what Sugimoto does is photograph a copy in Tokyo. So here we are in sort of the middle phase of the classic immigrant story I've started telling. First, the tourist sites, the dioramas. Now here, of course, he's beginning to comment on art. So the art is turning inward. It's taking the same kind of abstraction that we saw with the color of shadows that I just showed you. And in this sense, the critic John Yao, who normally I can't actually stand a word that John Yao writes, probably because it turns out I most of the time agree with him. It's a real strange kind of psychological thing. But here, Yale really gets what's going on in these Sugimotos. He says that the works are images of anecdotes rather than anecdotal images. So rather than telling stories, they're setting us up to think that they would tell stories without actually following on through. That would be, I guess, the equivalent of a kind of Americanism that's called the shaggy dog joke, where you have these big, long sort of setups to a joke, but then there's never a punchline at the end. So now we've got Sugimoto engaged in this kind of abstraction, further removing the work of art from the life that we live. I told you that the LA thing wasn't random. So Sugimoto goes to Los Angeles for his second degree, receives his first college diploma by mail from the University of Tokyo, because the University of Tokyo is shut down because of worker and student riots protesting the Vietnam War. And I don't exactly know what Australians know, but Americans have no idea that the Japanese were protesting the Vietnam War. And in fact, when you think about it, this protest about the United States staging its wars and its military presence in Japan ever since World War II is still going on. That's why Okinawa is still a constant site of international turmoil. So we still have a huge military presence there. And interestingly enough, just as an aside, Mark mentioned one of the Japanese artists that I've written on, a guy named Noriyuki Haraguchi. Haraguchi is often associated with Monaha. Lee Ufan is the most prominent Monaha artist. Haraguchi's very first work of art was actually a plywood effigy of an American military plane that the students dragged through the streets in a protest that was subsequently destroyed by the police. But so Sugimoto, goes to LA in the wake of these riots, as far as I can tell, uninterested in this side of life during the Vietnam era. Much more interested in this side of life during the Vietnam era. And I haven't exactly been able to figure out if this photograph is doctored. That, drop acid, not bombs, looks awfully bright to me. So it could be. Whether it's an actual photograph or not isn't really the point. The biggest point is that Sugimoto did not take the lessons from the left. He took the lessons on the right and engaged in all of the tremendous benefits of the summer of love. And in that respect, he said, at one point, I am an anachronist. And of course, I'd misread that the whole time, wishing he'd said something like, I'm an anarchist. But also then splitting that word apart in a different sort of a way, thinking, well, what he really means, instead of being a kind of a flashback to old-fashioned photographic techniques, that he means he's a guy without time. He's an anachronist. So, Sugimoto decides to drop acid, not bombs, takes hallucinogenic drugs, and comes up with the idea for his second major series, the theaters. So, I'm sure you all have seen some of these. What he does, so he first sneaks into movie theaters with his 4x5 view camera in the East Village, goes up to the balconies. A lot of these old movie theaters from the 20s have balconies. And when the film starts to roll, he clicks the shutter open, does that 90-minute or so exposure, and then closes it at the end of the credits. So in the photograph, the ambient light that gives us all of this luscious detail is cast by the film itself. And I've just shown you, Radio City Music Hall, and then 4 others, and I showed you. Here I've got 2 drive-ins because I know Australia has drive-ins as well. So this is an example of American drive-ins. And Sugimoto, in his tourist phase, is going around in the United States seeing our sites. And in thinking about Sugimoto and his engagement with hallucinogenic drugs, I couldn't help but also think about the author Michael Pollan. And Pollan, wrote The Omnivore's Dilemma. That's the book about what you should eat for a sustainable world. So Pollan, in a recent article this year in The New Yorker, writes an article on the research into psychedelic drugs as a palliative. The article is called Trip Treatment. And Pollan quotes a scientist who's now doing these experiments. And these, of course, have been banned in the United States since the early 1960s. Exceptionally difficult for anybody in the US to do experiments with LSD or psychedelic mushrooms or any kind of hallucinogenic drug. But it's just started again. So Pollan quotes the scientist who says, a high-dose psychedelic experience is death practice. You're losing everything you know to be real, letting go of your ego and your body, and that process can feel like dying. Now, in terms of mystical experiences, in terms of the scientific investigations, Pollan actually discusses something called the Pankey-Richards Metaphysical Experience Questionnaire. Now, that's a real thing. So it's 5 criteria, and they ask you, did you feel, loss of body? And they go through all these kinds of questions to determine whether or not you had an authentic mystical experience or something that's not authentically mystical. But it turns out that this mystical experience questionnaire is based on studies William James, who had been a psychologist and a philosopher, had conducted in his psychology lab at Radcliffe University, which is the women's college now, part of Harvard, in the late 19th century, with famous subjects such as Gertrude Stein, the great modernist author, and also Helen Keller. So, and James writes about this in his 1902 publication called The Varieties of Religious Experience. And of course, if you know anything about James, you might have heard about his radical pluralism, which he actually calls radical empiricism. So it's a belief that any kind of belief that one might hold that lets one be more successful in society is a true belief. So in James is open to all kinds of religious experiences. And in that chapter called Mysticism, James discusses his own experience with it. Of course, one of the hallmarks of a mystical experience, and this would be what, say, Saint Teresa writes about in her Orison of Unity, is this complete loss of body, and that coupled by the person's inability to explain to anybody what it was like. So no body leads to ineffability. So it's as if, when having a mystical experience, our own existence withdraws from itself. As we withdraw from our minds, and, strangely enough, find ourselves at peace without time. Now, curiously enough, thinking about losing our bodies and peace without time, in a lecture for one of his major exhibitions at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago in 2003, Sugimoto said, "In my work, no humans appear." Now, if you've been looking at the screen, you can look at that, right? And what are we looking at? Right? What's sitting here? And what's there? What about this? How about here? It looks like there might, at some point in time, have been people in the movie theater. But somehow, Sugimoto has transformed them, not from people, by turning these into static images. They're like ghosts of people, or they're somehow not people. Or he understands them not to be people, as their bodies and their temporal existence have been eliminated in his photographic process. Now I'm showing you these two images just for a couple reasons. One, I wanted to show you a Sugimoto portrait of Lenin because I just showed you the hammer and sickle, so I thought this made the nice next image. Two, this is Sugimoto in that downward spiral of internal conversation as he becomes part of this international art world. So what we're looking at is not a photograph of Lenin. It's a photograph of a wax statue of Lenin that Sugimoto took in Madame Tussauds in London. And of course, that wax statue is made from a photograph. So again, now you can begin to see the kind of collapse we had going on with the Duchamp piece. And then the second reason I'm showing you Sugimoto is I wanted to actually just show you a picture of Lenin, and that was the best Sugimoto I could find of somebody with a big beard that almost looked a bit like William James. So James, who had a tremendously long and distinguished career, one of the great books of the history of philosophy is written by one of his students, a man named Ralph Barton Perry, which is called The Thought and Character of William James's Philosophy. And in fact, the philosophy building at Harvard is named after Ralph Barton Perry, a student of James. But in the very first publication this man ever wrote, it's a book review of a pamphlet by somebody that I know you've never heard of because no one has ever heard of him, by a guy named Benjamin Paul Blood. Now, Blood was this sort of classic 19th century, Thoreau type of American figure. One of these, lives out, self-sufficient, publishes letters to the editor all over New England, developing their metaphysics. And it turns out that Blood has been described as a farmer, philosopher, athletic strongman, inventor, and now forgotten visionary. And, he published his metaphysics as letters to the editor in newspapers like the Concord Standard. So little tiny community newspapers. But it turns out he wasn't just simply a crank. He actually corresponded with and swapped letters with William James, but also Ralph Waldo Emerson, President Grover Cleveland. So this is a person whose ideas got a lot of attention. And Blood's book that James reviews is actually called The Anesthetic Revolution and the Gist of Philosophy, where he's talking about how anesthetics are revelatory and should be, the gist of philosophy. So William James takes him seriously like this and conducts his own experiments with nitrous oxide. So, nitrous oxide, that's drug that now comes in like little metal canisters that you would use for whipped cream or to inflate your bike tires. So nitrous oxide in the 19th century was the gentleman's alternative to ether. So James experiments with nitrous oxide as an attempt to create mystical experiences following blood's directions. So in the variety of religious experience, James writes, the keynote of it is invariably a reconciliation. It is as if the opposites of the world, whose contradictoriness and conflict make all of our difficulties and troubles, were melted into unity. To me, the living sense of its reality only comes in the artificial state of mind. Now that's, pretty interesting for two reasons. One, you can only get a real sense of reality in an artificial state of mind. And two, because James is talking about the unity of conflicts, and if you know your American philosophy, you know that American pragmatists aren't at all interested in Hegelian kinds of ideas. And here he sounds a bit like Hegel, where meaning is all in the synthesis of dialectical antinomies. And James knows that he sounds a bit like Hegel here, and he goes on and says, well, I sound a bit like Hegel, so it must be that this great philosopher had a particular sensitivity to mystical states and could enter into those through his own thinking. Now, in this sense, I was thinking, a bit about my sort of misunderstanding of Sugimoto saying he's a, anachronic. And of course, I was fascinated by William James and this idea of ana-aesthetic. Because of course I looked at this and I thought James is talking about, it's mysticism without aesthetics. It's not actually the stuff that dentists use to put you under to pull your wisdom teeth. And then I got to thinking, well, what would be the difference between a mystical experience and an aesthetic experience? And it seems like I could just follow James and lay this right on out for us, because the American pragmatists, and James in particular, call aesthetic an emotion. And of course, emotions are things that we can understand and name. Those of us who are better at naming our emotions can name them, and we know what it is we're feeling. But a mystical experience is one that hits us as pure affect that we can't communicate to anybody else because it's outside of the life that we live, the extension of time or space. And for James, it was that artificial means that causes us to free life from conscious. Now, when later on in his career, Sugimoto begins also to return to those Japanese roots, and of course is also interested in enlightenment, or at least interested in thinking about that in some kind of a way. So what we have here is Sea of Buddhas, and there are actually 48 of these photographs. So what Sugimoto did was, and 48 is apparently a mystical number in Buddhism. If any of you are specialties in Eastern religions, you might tell me why, but I don't exactly know other than it is. Because Japanese scholars, as you might imagine, really focus on this series and investigate both the history of these Buddha figures and Sugimoto's engagement with various kinds of Buddhist sects. So he goes to Kyoto, where there are 1,001 of these Buddha Vista figures. So there are 500 on one side of the hall, and there's a much larger one in the center, and then another 500 on the other side of the hall. And these are all Buddha Vista figures from the 12th and 13th century, and they're in the Hall of 33 Bays, the temple of Sanjusan Gendo in Kyoto, Japan. And this, as you might imagine, is a really well-known shrine, still practices, there's still monks there. Sugimoto had to sneak in first thing in the morning before the monks would come for their daily prayers. And he takes these photographs elevated up on a stepladder, kind of like in the movie theaters, kind of, again, to continue to displace our sense of bodily presence from the image. And this was such a vast Buddhist temple that during the samurai times, they would actually apparently hold archery tournaments to see who could send their arrows the whole length of this. And the samurai and the Buddhism isn't just a random comment on my part, because it turns out that, again, something I hadn't known, that there's a whole strand of a kind of esoteric Buddhism that isn't about, kind of peaceful meditation and accepting the world for what it is, or any of the kind of ideas we may have about Buddhism because of thinking about doing yoga, something like that. Turns out there's a whole kind of Buddhism where the spiritual, and I'm quoting Norman Bryson, who writes on this in a really interesting article on the notion of time in Sugimoto's photographs, extended out to millennia. That's his claim. But he says there's a kind of Buddhism where the spiritual involves a high degree of aggressiveness and destruction. And of course, if you saw David Mitchell's, the Wachowskis' Cloud Atlas, or read the book Cloud Atlas, you know that the whole theme of both that movie and the book, and in many ways, David Mitchell's whole series of projects, extended books that all revolve around the same kind of themes, is exactly that kind of aggressiveness and destruction. And, Mitchell, you may not know, is finalist for 2 Man Booker Prizes. So, most recently, Frederick Jameson, in his book, The Antinomies of Realism, devotes the final chapter of that extended study of literary realism to Cloud Atlas, and not the movie version, but the actual novel version, and writes that in Cloud Atlas, which spans the 18th century Pacific journals of Adam Ewing up through Sonmi, which is a future God figure from after the first apocalypse in kind of a new soul, to back here in the neo-primitive where Tom Hanks and Halle Berry as the characters Zaki and Marinim inhabit yet another primitive society just on the big island of Hawaii. Jameson writes that the realist novel now needs to skip the present, and there are no chapters in Cloud Atlas that deal with this time, our age of internet and global capitalism. It needs to skip the present and integrate the future with the past. And of course, that's what Mitchell does. The way this unfolds is 5 successive stories over the course of, say, 500 years, from about the 1800s to the future. Each of those stories is interrupted at a key moment. Then there's a central story that's told in completion, and then the book closes in reverse order. So the very first chapter of this may be of particular interest to you all because it's called The Pacific Journal of Adam Ewing, and it's set in the Chatham Islands of New Zealand, and it involves the struggles between the Maui Ori and the Maori, and how the Maori destroy this pacifist tribe that refuses to fight back. And then the complete story is actually here. It's Schlussa's Crossing and Everything After. It involves Zaki. And when you encounter a character called Marinim, of course that demands that you go to your dictionary because you're dealing with some kind of rhetorical trope. Because anytime you see that NYM ending, there's something going on. So I did that and I looked it up. It's interesting because a Marinim is one of those tropes that we don't often talk about, but perfect for David Mitchell, who must have somehow encountered that, because what it is part for whole. So for instance, it would be using wheels for cars. And it differs from a metonym where you have the same kind of scale. So it would be like, Hollywood for the film industry. So in thinking about the characters that appear over and over again in different bodies in the science fiction of David Mitchell, we actually have a Maronymic structure because each character is simply part of this larger continuum of death and reincarnation. And, Mitchell describes both his literary project as a whole, but also this novel. He says that his theme is reincarnation of the same soul in different bodies. And if you've read it or watched the movie, and this is, on Amazon, I watched it on Amazon, you know that Sonmi 451, and that's her name there, Sonmi 451, is in this future neo-soul society, like the Buddha, she's a fabricant or a clone that was grown to be a slave to work at a kind of new version of McDonald's, something called Papa Songs, who elevates from down under the earth to become human and gain consciousness. And of course, she has to be destroyed because of that. So in 2007, Mitchell explained, he said, the book's theme is predacity, the way individuals prey on individuals, groups on groups, nations on nations, tribes on tribes. And one of Mitchell's characters, Dr. Henry Goose, and another one of his characters, Old Georgie, I think said it best, and they said it twice. They said, the weak are meat, the strong do eat. And of course, it's interesting. The first time we hear that is Dr. Henry Goose saying it in Adam's story. And like Marinem, you've got to figure that Adam is a deliberate choice. The first man in the story, the first character, subsequently reincarnated over the course of 400 or 500 years of the story. And then when Old Georgie says it, it's actually in quotation marks. So it's as if the predator, the evil form that continues through the reincarnation of the souls, has itself been reincarnated. So Old Georgie is actually quoting Dr. Henry Goose. And this is Sugimoto's third series. These are the seascapes. The way the early works, the early black and whites unfold, is the dioramas, the theaters, the seascapes. So, he travels all over, takes these elevated photographs of seas and oceans, and in some cases, like the Great Lakes between the United States and Canada. So again, this question of where we might situate ourselves in the image is raised. There's actually no place for us to be, consequently no scale, because there's no human measurement. So these could be vast. In fact, they're only vast, and vast isn't the right word. There's no measurement there because we can't be there. And of course, I'm showing you the Tasman Sea just because that's fun for me to show it to you. But they're all over the world, and they're both night seascapes, and some of them you don't have the nice horizon line, even if it's always dead centered in the composition. Some of them you have light reflecting off the water and so forth. But in all cases, that horizon line is centered, and you can probably tell, can you see the little corner things here? This is actually quite small. These are shot by an 1810, an 8 by 10, so this is 16 by 20. It was only later in his career when Sugimoto says, I realized if I made my photographs larger, I could sell them for a lot more money, that he begins to really blow them up. So the work that caught my eye, that really made me think there was something worth thinking about going on, was actually one of those theaters that was blown up very large and selling for $400,000. That caught my eye also. But this is a small one, and if you see it in person, like I have, because the Art Institute of Chicago owns 57 of these, this black looks like it's laid on with a putty knife. It is so tremendously gorgeous. So it just really shows you, that anachronistic side, that real attention to the craft of photography. However, being seduced by the gorgeousness, I can't help but wonder, well, what am I looking at? Why is it split down the middle like that? Where am I in it? So the gorgeousness as the bait, and then the displacement as the hook he sets. And I had thought, I'd toyed with the idea of showing you this with a Bryce Martin. So, like two of Martin's canvases jammed on top of each other to give you the physical divide that then sort of satirizes our desire to see landscapes in the organization. And I'd thought about showing you this next to, say, a Mark Rothko, which of course we hope that we can see through into some kind of spiritual or aesthetic or mystical revelation, just to show us how it's set up and denied. So what have we had? We've had 3 deaths and 3 immortalities. And I think that it could be really productive to think of the limit conditions on contemporary art nowadays being death, which is the physical out of time, and immortality, which is, the mystical or metaphysical out of time. We've had 3 deaths and 3 immortalities. We started with Sugimoto's bodiless photographs, where art withdraws from life. We moved to James's drug-induced mysticism, where life withdraws from conscious. And we concluded with Mitchell's historical predation, where conscious withdraws from world, over and over again. Art, philosophy, faith. These are 3 ways of filling the gaps between what Adams, not the character, but Parveen Adams, the photo critic, what Adams called reality and the real. Explanations from our own personal experience. But I can't help but think that these gaps are never truly filled. And I've been, like I told you, sort of noticing the findings of quantum physics. Things like studies where when we set up an instrument to absorb the electron on an atom, it looks like a particle but behaves like a wave. And we set up another instrument to catch its wave behavior. It looks like a wave but behaves like a particle. The way that we can never grasp reality, how it always withdraws from our ability to take charge of it, always submerging beyond our abilities. And I can't help but notice that in this new age of climate death, that we can no longer deny ourselves to human security. Can't simply wish away the world or make it subject to our desires. And of course, that's Australia 100 years from now. Rather than metaphysics, it's realities such as these that demand what the philosopher Crispin Sartwell recently called a recommitment to the world. And, as the speculative realist Graham Harman put it in 2010, and I don't think it matters, if Harman's a good philosopher or not. I think there's a lot interesting here, and certainly what he says is well worth remembering. He says, however interesting we humans may be to ourselves, we are apparently in no way central to the cosmic drama. Marooned as we are on an average-sized planet near a mediocre sun and confined to a tiny portion of the universe. Harman's is an inhuman world perfect for Mitchell's inhuman ethics, James's inhuman experience, and Sugimoto's inhuman photographs. It is a world freed from the stranglehold of death and immortality, one finally safely withdrawn from our command. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I think we have some time for questions which I think the paper has provoked, or certainly me, but I'm going to keep myself quiet, or at least try to, and open up to the floor. Now, you will be bringing a mic around, if in fact we can grab one that's on. And if you can stick your hand up and wait for the mic to arrive, that would be great, so that we can listen hear you and then bring the hall. Please stick your hand up nice and, because you're dark out there, so I really have to see the hand. But yes, one at the back. Definitely 2 ways in that one. About as far from you as we can get. Sorry about that.
Thank you for presenting the most unusual lecture. 2 things. You touched on the samurai traditions relating to Sugimoto, and currently, even today, there are many intellectuals in Japan that write about the code of Bushido, and in an effort to understand that even the current character of the Japanese people, trying to get into their minds. That's one thing, and so the question then becomes, do you sense or have you any notions of the impact of Bushido on Sugimoto's work? And secondly, have you misinterpreted that piece of art behind you? Because to me it looks like an interpretation or an attempt to interpret life as eternity. Perhaps that aspect of his spiritualism that might come from Bushido. Perhaps you could comment on those thoughts.
Well, yeah, I mean, the first part is particularly interesting. Thomas Kelline back in 1992 has a pretty interesting interview and then article on Sugimoto and points out that Sugimoto had to leave the East to come to the West to find himself interested in his Japanese traditions. So in terms of any kind of real engagement with Bushido, I don't believe that he has one. I haven't heard him talk about that. However, interestingly enough, as he's been reinvestigating these Japanese roots, there have been some pretty interesting projects. So there's a very famous screen of painting from the 16th century of Japanese pine trees. So he went back to try to find these pine groves that would match that screen. And of course, they've all been destroyed for development and so forth. But he found suitable pine trees in the Imperial Gardens in Tokyo and makes a whole series of photographs of the pine trees. So his version of this traditional Japanese masterpiece. And then there's also a project on the art island Nakashima, where he goes and restores a Japanese Shinto shrine, the Go-O shrine in Nakashima. So he's restoring, and I forget the century of that shrine, but he's doing it with optical glass, so to bring it into his sort of contemporary art commitments. And then there have been sort of other smaller projects. For instance, there's a rock garden at a sushi restaurant in Tokyo. And then there's a restored 17th century building that's been turned into a French restaurant. So in terms of any kind of deep engagement with Bushido ideas, I don't believe that exists. However, he does seem to be interested in that heritage in a certain kind of a way. The question of whether I've misinterpreted, of course that's certainly a possibility, but what I think that I'm showing you is how Sugimoto is trying to deny ourselves access to the image. So in that way, I think he's trying to deny our ability to have any kind of stable projection of our own hopes and desires. So I think that what he's interested in doing is barring us from entering into the image as if it were a blank wall that would distance itself completely from us. And then in that sense, I think that it is denying us both what I had called death, which I understand is kind of sort of information about the world that we have no access to, because once you die, you have no access to that information, or immortality, which I take to be some kind of aesthetic or mystical, intuitive understanding of the world. I think Sugimoto gives us neither, which is how, in terms of what I'm trying to show here today, I think that we can think about contemporary art and literature, and contemporary meaning stretching all the way back, I guess, to the 19th century or turn of the last century philosophy, because I understand James's writings in philosophy as being a cultural product equal to the Mitchell literature and to the Sugimoto photography, not one explaining the other as some kind of a master narrative. But I think that we can reach back and discuss all three outside of these traditional entrenched dichotomies of aesthetic experience or critical engagement, and figure out another way to talk about cultural products, a way that withdraws themselves from us. I think that may give us an access to an ethical understanding of cultural practice that's no longer human-centric, but that acknowledges this changing world that we're now facing, that things are beyond our command. And in some ways, this is simply topical, because perhaps it would make no sense to do a kind of interpretation like this, say 30 years ago, when we weren't facing the complete melt of the Arctic ice shelf, or Antarctic ice shelf, one or the other, but likely both. So, in the quest to find continued relevance, or test for continued validity, cultural practices, whenever they lay, it seems like you can develop ethical metrics to engage them now.
Okay, we have a question from John out here, and then we'll go up to the top again.
Are you familiar with the concept of sunyata?
I'm sorry, what?
Are you familiar with the concept of sunyata?
No.
It's a Sanskrit concept of nothingness, which is a plenitude, is a growth. And there are Japanese words for it. And when I look at these photographs in particular, but also the these photographs of the sea, and the photographs of the dioramas in the Natural History Museum, the word which comes into my mind is yohaku, which means the margin, the surplus, the meaning beyond which comes into presence because of the way the fictitious reality is being looked at. Have you thought about it?
Well, I haven't thought about that concept at all, but of course I've thought about the issue of meaning in these works of art. And I think that one of their great contributions, one of the ways that they are, say, really different from that Thomist demand, is I do not believe that they're about meaning. I believe that they're about showing us that we can't make any meaning adhere to them. And I believe that rather than, we could sort of, quibble and say, well, that's the meaning of them, that they refuse to allow meaning. But I think that's the consequence of them rather than the meaning of them. And, I'm acutely aware that as works of art get increasingly spare, that of course everyone brings their own backgrounds and desires and beliefs to make sense of them. And what, at least I found over and over again in the literature, is that the writing on the Sugimoto photographs is that time and time again they resist our efforts to have them to pin down a meaning, to pin down a kind of experience. So rather than, I think this is, Mark got me quite right at the beginning, rather than talk about what a work of art means, which I think that, we would have a fun debating society with all 70 of you that would go on for years, I want to ask what art does. So I'm interested in, like James, the consequences of the work of art. And I find that the Sugimoto does a wonderful job at displacing us, not letting us control it.
Hello. I'm interested in asking about these later, in your presentation, pictures in relation to photography. I know Sugimoto, when he's talked about these pictures in a lot of his work, he's talking about time, and he said, I think he started making these pictures looking for a landscape that was, the same compared to ancient times. And in the pictures of the animals and in the pictures in the cinemas, there's that sense of time as well in photography. But you also, in the pictures of the animals in particular, these ones, you seem to be talking about how by not making pictures of real things, he's mirroring the idea of the emptiness or the death of the photograph. And in the cinema, again, there's that distancing, and it's really, there's that layer in which we're talking about this work as a photographic work, it's referencing the practice of photography conceptually. I'm wondering if you see that conceptual link in the as a concept about photography in the seascape pictures?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, of course, Sugimoto says, quite rightly, he says, my work of art is about time. And he says about these seascapes is, you know, I'm capturing a time before the first human walked the earth, which would be one of the reasons he might say there are no humans in my photographs. But of course, when, you know, an artist says, my work is about time, well, you have to ask, well, what about time? Of course, time is something that sounds both profound, so it's easy for me to stand up here and talk about time and sound like I'm, you know, deep in a kind of a way. So lots of artists, as they start reflecting on their practice, want to tie it to these kinds of vast, ever fascinating, deep ideas of which there's no answer. But I'm interested in, you know, well, what kind of time might Sugimoto be trying to get at? What is this about? And I think, you know, rather than this being an illustration of a moment in the history of existence before people lived, it's a time, it's a work of art that doesn't allow time in it, because that time is always brought by us. We are what extends moments spatially, both past and to the future. So to say that this is, you know, about time, he's really talking about a different kind of an issue. So when I talk about Sugimoto's work refusing time because they're static, what I'm talking about is how he has removed any sense of this continuity, the lived experience from it. So we're looking at something, I guess in one way, like, you know, a moment in history before humans existed. We're looking at actually images or scenes or constructions outside of time in any kind of a way that we would understand it or experience or feel it. There's no extension there. But of course, you know, quite rightly, there are all these art world insider games that Sugimoto likes to play. So in many ways, the works of art, as one of the critics complained, collapse into a whole series of references and counter-references. So we have the little game here in the photographs where, well, you know, of course, a projected film is a time-based art, and yet here we've captured it in a frozen image. So we get that essential contradiction in one way. I just think there's something more interesting going on there than just that. And of course, Sugimoto, besides saying, you know, the theme of all my work of art is time, likes to say, I have Duchamp always on my mind. So the issue of Duchamp, like I think I tried to get at earlier, is a ever-increasing abstraction or removal of art from the material world, as it begins to be this spiral in and of itself, a private conversation which closes down rather than opens up. But I think that removal and that close down could be productively engaged through this question of the withdrawal of human experience.
I'll fill in the silence while we wait for another question. The thing is, you made all these. You made an interesting joke about, you know, this will be Australia in 100 years' time. I mean, environmentally inflected humour noir or whatever about kind of the age of the Anthropocene and what it's doing to us. But I mean, if you think, I mean, it just seems like there's a couple of things about time. These long series. I mean, in the 1970s, few people talked of the age of the Anthropocene being finally among us. Whatever environmental language there was, it wasn't that, right? You talk about gradual withdrawal, but it's almost hard not to see, you know, something of the, you know, when we look at the Natural History Museum's reflection of the kind of wealth of the animal past or whatever, as captured by that, we almost see past. I see past the game of Sugimoto's reality to, you know, the stuff of, you know, heroic 19th century attempts to convey to the world the, you know, the plenitude of the earth. And I see in the cinema ones, you know, it's about light, it's about the human ability to project light artificially into a room, and sort of, in other words, it's about all the things that we now see, you know, the Anthropocene has changed everything because we have artificial light, which has changed the light conditions of everything. And it's, to me, in other words, in 2015, these photographs look different. I mean, we see them differently, at least. And I wonder, what's the effect of these, you know, isn't this a test case of kind of a series of things that stretches over a long time, whose beginning point and whose end point are very different periods in our conception of our own, you know, place in the universe or whatever it might be. I mean, things have changed pretty radically from the moment of the 70s to now. I don't see it as a continuum, or as... So I wonder, you've made a compelling case for this gradual withdrawal of kind of points of reference in reality and consciousness in sort of life at all. But it feels like we can't help but rush in, or things can't help but rush in and fill up these images with ways of seeing, at least, if not meaning. So I wonder, do they sort of always fight back against the attempt to strip?
Yeah, well, let's see, it's a great question in a lot of ways. One, I don't think I'm trying to explain Sugimoto. It's definitely not an explanation of what he's doing. It's an interpretation of the art, and it's an interpretation of the art, the philosophy, and the literature in a way that does what I had promised I was going to do, which is to pull it relentlessly up into the present and test it for value now. So that's a very different kind of methodology. So rather than explanation, it's interpretation. Or, as someone once accused William James of being, persuasive without argument. And the reason for this as a methodological practice is exactly kind of what I was complaining about in terms of, you know, Duchamp or art conversations that are private and internally spiraling that ever abstract themselves, is when we begin to explain, we further remove things from the world that we live. They become abstracted and intellectual rather than dynamically engaged. So for instance, I'm not inventing this myself, this would be like someone like David Hume would say that geometry is an abstract art. So I'm trying to eliminate the abstraction of the Sugimoto and the Mitchell and the James by giving it an interpretation rather than an explanation, by asking, you know, when we look at this now, in only the now context, not in, say, 1975, when these started, you know, what can we do with it? Can it have any pressure or viability on the world that we must live in today, rather than being, you know, historical artifacts or talking about, say, you know, photographic practices in California in 1975 or whatnot? It's a very different kind of approach to dealing with cultural objects. And I've also, you know, attempted to keep them all on the level where, you know, they mutually inform each other, and I think that you could at least see the motivation in that, you know, James and Sugimoto with the hallucinogenic drugs and so forth, that these are overlapping cultural practices that seem to have a contemporary currency, even if they're separated by, say, 200 years.
Yes, I was shortly. We're going to try to get to a new question if we can. Any other? Yes. Can you give me the mic? Please.
Thank you. Fantastic. It's not really a question. I'm wanting to hear more of your thoughts, and so, and I've got a mess of my own. And you mentioned, you know, what's this person who's interested in the 60s and the type of art that you write about, discussing these photographs, which are representations of non-representations in a way. And I guess I was thinking of George Kugler's Shape of Time. And recently I've had cause to read it, and I think there's something similar when he's describing the actual, which was something like a really big word in the 60s, the actual, the now, as being that blank darkness in between the two beats of a lighthouse flashing. It's that, and that you can't know now, that you have to be outside of the now to be able to know now. And he's talking about it in terms of art history, that you can't describe the art of now until it's past. And you mentioned the realist novel having to leave out the present and integrate the past and the future. Yeah, it's all amazing to think about, but I'm finding it, when you're saying it's something to utilise in, are you saying it's something to utilise this way of thinking when we look at art? It's, yeah, so, yeah, as I said, I haven't really got a question, but I'm trying to work out. So we're not seeking meaning because we're in this gap, and the death and the mystical experience, where the mystical experience is everything, whereas death is nothing. I don't know the Tasman Sea. You've got the horizon in the middle. You've got one side here and the other side there. Is there really a gap? It's as though you're trying to get us to be in the gap, but we can never be in the gap, or something. I don't know.
Well, you know, you've done a great job of putting together Kubler in Questions of Time, because he was tremendously influential for lots of thinkers in the 1960s. So Shape of Time's a incredibly important book for not Sugimoto's generation of artists, because he's younger, but for the generation that came before him. Somebody like Robert Smithson writes on The Shape of Time. Smithson's born in maybe 36. So Smithson's a whole generation of artists older than Sugimoto. What's interesting, about Sugimoto is although he'll say things like, my art is all about time, he'll leave it at that. And there's no interest in providing any kind of particular theoretical or authority anchor for what exactly he means by that. So, and I've wanted to talk to him, and he doesn't want to talk to me. I don't exactly know why, but his people say that he doesn't talk to academics because people like me would say, so did you read George Kubler's The Shape of Time when you were in college? So I think one of the things that's so interesting is he has a real, he says, the sense of the fake is the quality I most try to get at in my work of art. So has a real eye for these kind of edge conditions where you're just not sure what's going on, so that we could say, inadequately and unsatisfactorily come up with meanings, but also know that they're not good enough, that they're failing the work of art that we see. And I would, just to continue my thoughts on meaning in art, say that that's actually the mark of a great work of art, is that every single meaning somebody seeks to apply to it fails, that work of art is always bigger than a meaning. And, I, for whatever reason, think that Sugimoto has done a real nice job, and he has attracted some serious attention from art historians such as Hans Belting and Norman Bryson and Richard Schiff. I mean, the list of people trying to take a stab at what's going on in these photographs is pretty impressive. So in that sense, because people feel the need, and I guess I do too, to keep trying to figure out a way of handling or getting at or conveying to other people what they think is going on here is something, like Mark was suggesting, will perhaps, never end.
I think we need to wrap up fairly soon because it's coming to 8 and you want to see the next light show and you want to be out there. But I'll reflect just one. I don't know how many of you were here to hear Hal Foster a few months back talking about excess, mimetic excess. You've taken us to sort of sparsity and the total, and both of you made compelling cases for these being kind of signature trait of
kind of contemporary art culture, and it seems a very diametrically opposed vision of where art is leading us, at least. Anyway, I want to leave that thought dangling, and thank you very much, David, for a very compelling lecture.
Great, thank you all.